Imagine being the only human at a university full of aliens, and your professor starts a lecture about how your ancestors were basically mindless, spaceship-eating monsters. What would you do? Alden Renner was about to find out, and trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next. He was sitting in the front row of a lecture hall that looked like it was carved from a giant skeleton, trying his best not to fall asleep. He'd made the classic freshman mistake of sitting up front on day one, and now he was stuck there, pretending to be fascinated by the dust dancing in the projector light. The class was Xenohistory 301, Evolutionary Dead Ends and Collapsed Civilizations. It was the only elective that fit his schedule, and his advisor promised it would be an easy A. That was a lie. Up front, Professor Vrigg, who looked like a giant walking piece of petrified wood, was droning on. His voice was a low hum that made Alden's teeth vibrate, with glowing filaments drifting from his polished head instead of a face, and deep amber pits for eyes. The professor moved with a slow, tree-like patience that was putting everyone to sleep. Alden had privately decided Professor Vrigg was the living embodiment of a boring textbook footnote. "And so," Vrigg hummed, waving a branch-like arm at a flickering hologram, "we see the same pattern. When a species lets its aggression run wild, it collapses on itself, like a dying star." He listed off a few extinct races, the Geish, the Seal, the Eldarim, all just sad stories in a history book. A few of the other students rustled. There were bird-like Valari, formless glibs that shimmered with color, and even some rock-skinned hermites. Alden tried to hide a yawn. He'd heard this story 1,000,000 times. Every advanced species in the galaxy loved to talk about peace right after they'd finished conquering all their neighbors. But the best example, Vrigg continued, with what Alden guessed was a flair for the dramatic, is the tragic case of the Terrans. Alden's head snapped up. His boredom vanished, replaced by a cold dread. A new image appeared on the hologram, an artist's twisted fantasy of a human. It was a hulking, ape-like beast with a jaw full of fangs, mottled green skin, and tiny, glowing red eyes. In its hand, it held a massive club that looked suspiciously like a giant femur. The Terrans, Vrigg said, savoring the word, or humans as they called themselves, were a classic case of a hyper-aggressive species. Their entire culture was built on violence. The hologram shifted to a grainy old photo Alden vaguely recognized, a monster truck crushing a line of smaller cars. "According to our only probe that ever made it back," Vrigg explained, "this was their main war ritual. The lead tribe would build a giant metal monster, which our probe called a mangler, and use it to smash symbols of their enemies. Their main form of communication was just screaming at each other at the top of their lungs." A bird-like student behind Alden let out a terrified little chirp. Alden felt a crazy urge to laugh, but it got stuck in his throat. This was beyond wrong. It was insane. Their society was a mess of constant fighting and bizarre self-destruction, Vrigg lectured on, totally lost in his own bogus theory. They poisoned their own air and used up all their resources. But the final nail in the coffin, the ultimate proof of their savagery, came from that probe's final log. He paused for dramatic effect. The probe was damaged when it landed, and the Terrans swarmed it. "Its last entry is scrambled but clear," Vrigg continued. "It registered being taken apart. Its repair nanites activated, but the simple software logged the event as consumption by local life forms. The Terrans ate it." Gasps filled the room. Students squirmed in their seats. "They ate a thinking machine," Vrigg stated, his voice flat. "This is the ultimate proof of a species doomed to fail. We believe they wiped themselves out in a massive war not long after. A messy, brutal end for a messy, brutal people." Vrigg stood there, basking in the silence, proud of his brilliant deduction. The sheer stupidity of it all was making it hard for Alden to breathe. A monster truck rally was a war ritual? Humans ate a metal probe? He pictured a bunch of cavemen chewing on titanium, and a laugh bubbled up in his chest. He choked it down and slowly, deliberately raised his hand. But Vrigg just glanced at him, clearly planning to ignore him and wrap up his grand speech. Alden sighed. Politeness wasn't going to work. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice echoing in the silent hall. Sorry, but we're still here." For 3 solid seconds, nobody moved. The words just hung in the air. Then, all at once, 100 alien faces turned to him in pure, unfiltered shock. A student made of rock literally fainted, slumping to the floor with a loud thud. A jello-like glib shrieked and melted into a terrified, shimmering puddle. The bird alien behind Alden screeched and scrambled away, her feathers puffed out in alarm. The room exploded into chaos. Students trampled each other trying to get away from him, away from the monster in the front row. Professor Vrigg was frozen solid, making a high-pitched whining noise like stressed wood, the sound of his entire career turning to dust. Alden didn't move. He just sat there as campus security, 2 massive armored guards, burst in with their plasma rifles ready. They saw the stampede, then they saw him, sitting alone, looking about as threatening as someone who'd just missed their bus. He slowly raised his hands, more tired than scared. Well, he thought to himself, this is going to be a whole lot of paperwork. The observation room they put him in was weirdly calm, with soft white walls and a single chair that felt like a blob of warm clay. He was basically a museum exhibit now, titled Living Fossil. Every few hours, a slot in the wall would open and slide out a bowl of beige protein paste and some water. They'd given him a data tablet loaded with thousands of years of painfully boring alien poetry and a game about sorting shapes by their mood. He was actually getting pretty good at spotting a sad dodecahedron. He was halfway through his 3rd bowl of protein paste when the wall chimed and rippled, turning into a screen. It was the bird-like student from his class, Talia. "You," she chirped, her voice translated by his implant. "You are the Terran." "Alden Renner," he said, pushing the beige goo away. "And you're Talia," she replied, her crest feathers fluttering. "I need to apologize for how everyone reacted. That was not very academic of us." "It's fine," Alden said with a slight smile. "I guess it's not every day your history lesson starts talking back to you." A series of rapid clicks came from her, which his implant translated as laughter. "Indeed," she said. "I've been looking at the security logs for your room. The lockdown is pretty serious, and yet you managed to get a call out to me. Your room is on the university's academic network, isn't it?" Alden just grinned. This was going to be fun. The computer system had a legacy backdoor for sharing data, a flaw the university always seemed to overlook. Getting past it was a fun little mental puzzle. "Glad I could be a walking anomaly for you," Auden said with a dry tone. Talia leaned into her comms device, her eyes locked on him. "Could I ask a few follow-up questions? Your biology seems to completely contradict the official historical record." "Go for it. Is your jaw strong enough to chew on processed metal alloys?" Auden quipped. "No, I get plenty of iron from leafy greens and the occasional steak. This is fascinating. The record says your species communicates through ritualized screaming. Is the way you're talking now a recent evolutionary change, or were the original probes just wrong?" "Let's go with deeply, deeply wrong." "And what about the mangler, the great metal beast used in your ritual warfare?" "That was a monster truck rally," Auden explained, rubbing his temples. "It was just for fun. People would drive these huge modified trucks over smaller, older cars. They were loud, kind of dumb events where, for the most part, nobody really got hurt." Talia's crest feathers twitched as she tried to make sense of it all. After a long silence, she said, "The gap between the accepted Terran myth and what you're telling me is statistically significant. It's a bombshell. Honestly, nothing this interesting has happened at this university in my entire lifetime," she chirped, her voice suddenly buzzing with an intense energy. "Professor Vrigg built his whole career on the Terran myth. You just destroyed his life's work with a single sentence." "I was just trying to get through a lecture," Auden sighed. "The administration is going to try and cover this up. They'll try to label you a fake, a genetic mutation, or some kind of elaborate prank from a rival school. They can't stand a contradiction this massive," she said, her expression growing sharp. "I can help you. The truth is the most important thing in academics. Help me how? I have access to the university's main data archives, Talia said. All of them. We'll find the original survey data, the report that started this whole Terran myth. We're going to uncover what really happened. Auden looked at her eager, curious face. Here he was, alone, basically a prisoner on an alien world, and the entire galaxy was convinced he was some kind of baby-eating monster. A brilliant, nosy alien academic was probably the best ally he could have ever wished for. Okay, Talia Shavine, he said, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he smiled. Let's go digging. Administrator Filk, a mid-level bureaucrat of the Gloopklip species, decided his morning was officially ruined. A Priority 1 red flag case file had just landed on his main data slate with the electronic thump of a dying star. Its arrival made the slate vibrate so hard it knocked over his third cup of Keist for the shift. He was a short, multi-limbed creature, like a frantic mix of an otter and a spider. 4 of his limbs held data slates of different importance. A 5th clutched his still full drink, and he used the 6th to scratch a patch of fur behind his head that was perpetually stressed. The file's title was a sign of pure bureaucratic doom. Species Status Query. Terran designation, Pre-FTL Quarantine 4. Cross-reference, University Security Incident 84 Gamma. Flisk's fur stood on end. Quarantine 4? That classification was so ancient it felt like it was carved on stone tablets. The protocol was simple. Aggressive pre-FTL species, approach prohibited, engagement prohibited, permit self-destruction. Regulations demanded these files stay buried. They were the bureaucratic version of a septic tank. You know it's there, but you are strongly advised not to poke it with a stick. With a low groan, he used a spare limb to tap the file open. The document was a digital train wreck, a chaotic mix of ancient scan data, contradictory notes, and so many warning flags they blocked out the original text. The main document was a horribly panicked report from a Mark III surveyor probe. Flisk shuddered. Mark IIIs had a well-known history of sensor glitches and terrible translation errors. They were the entire reason Regulation 11B existed. Always use your best resources for first contact. The report had flags for every warning imaginable: biohazard, extreme aggression, unpredictable technology, and his personal favorite, sentient machinery consumption risk. The last official update written by a human was from 93 standard years ago. A chime from his comm unit cut him off. The face of his direct boss, Chief Administrator Plor, appeared. Plor was an Earmite, and his face, a series of calm, fleshy folds, had all the expressive warmth of a rock. "Flisk," Plor rumbled, "you have the file. The file has graced my desk with its disastrous presence." "Yes, Chief Administrator," Flisk said, his voice a series of rapid-fire squeaks. "It seems we have misplaced a species of machine-eating savages." "We have misplaced nothing," Plor corrected, his voice like the slow grind of stone on stone. "There appears to be an administrative discrepancy. A student at Aiket University claims to be one of them." "A student?" Flisk squeaked. "How does a creature from a Tier 4 quarantine world enroll in a university? Did he fill out the intersystem admissions form 79 Delta? Was it notarized? Because the paperwork for a quarantine species is an absolute nightmare." "That," Plor said, "is what you will find out. The Cultural Outreach Initiative processed an application from a newly spacefaring species from the Sol system. Standard procedure. The initiative processed the application without checking it against the Threat Containment Division's quarantine list because the 2 department databases run on incompatible old systems. It's a problem that's been ignored since the last budget cut 400 years ago. Flisk felt a migraine begin to bloom behind his many eyes. Of course that's what happened. "There's more," Plor continued, his voice even lower. "The official monitor for the Sol system, stationed out in the Oort cloud, has been filing an automated no significant change report every single week for the last 93 years. So I need to figure out how the galaxy's most dangerous boogeyman applied for college and why our guy on the scene has been asleep at his post for almost a century, Flisk summarized, his voice flat. Handle it, Plor ordered, and be quiet about it. The higher-ups are worried this could be a major public embarrassment. The connection ended. Flisk stared at the cursed file. He chugged his caffeine in one long gulp, the hot liquid burning his throat. He needed a lot more. This wasn't just a case file. This was a festival of incompetence, career-ending, spread across multiple departments and spanning the entire galaxy. And he was standing right at ground zero. With a sigh that ruffled the fur over his entire body, he set his other slates to auto-sort and focused all his limbs on the Terran file. This was going to be a long day. Auden sat in front of a panel of university deans. The room was small, dark, and smelled like old books and judgment. Professor Vrigg, standing off to one side like a brooding statue, held Auden's glare. The octane was humming with that low, angry energy again. "So you are sticking with this story," said the head dean, an Emite named Dean Olin. Her voice was a low, resonant rasp like boulders grinding together. "You claim to be a human from the planet Earth." "That's where I was born," Auden said, keeping his voice steady. "I've got the birth certificate to prove it. It's on my student file." "A document can be easily faked," Vrigg snapped, his voice shaking. "This is obviously an elaborate hoax, a pathetic grab for attention by pretending to be a member of a dead species. I demand he submit to a full biological scan. We have to confirm his freakish and most likely engineered nature." Auden leaned forward. "With all due respect, Professor, your entire theory about my people is based on one single, panicked encounter from centuries ago. One data point is just a story. You need more to call it a pattern." "It was a verified compact survey," Vrigg shot back. "A Mark III survey, wasn't it?" Talia's crest feathers twitched suddenly. "Those models had a reputation for sensor ghosts and mistaking weather patterns for life forms, right? How many sentient gas clouds did the compact try to offer trade deals to because a Mark III misread a weather balloon?" A few of the deans shifted in their seats uncomfortably. The Mark III mess was a famously embarrassing chapter in the compact's history of exploration. And this probe, Auden pressed on. It landed in the middle of what was probably a human settlement in its pre-industrial age. If you thought a planet was full of monsters, would you send your best diplomats, or a drone that was cheap, terrified, and half-broken to begin with? Dean Olin steepled her blocky, mineral-covered fingers. "The student raises a valid point about the integrity of the data. The source is weak." "Weak?" Vrigg's voice rose in pitch. "It is the foundational text on predatory societal collapse. It is a single, unconfirmed report from a model of probe known for being unreliable," Olin cut in, her voice firm. "We are tabling your request for an invasive biological scan, Professor. The subject is now under the jurisdiction of the Galactic Compact. Their investigators will take over the matter." Vrigg looked like he was about to vibrate into pieces. He made a buzzing sound of pure fury. "Procedure must be followed," Olin rumbled. She turned her stony eyes to Auden. "Security will take you back to your rooms. You are to be kept isolated from anyone outside the university until the Compact's people get here. Is that understood?" "Understood," Auden said. 2 security guards escorted him out. As he walked past Talia, one of her crest feathers twitched in a very specific way. He understood the message perfectly. Phase 1 complete. The chaos is escalating beautifully. Model saw. It was a tiny victory, but it felt monumental. He had managed to crack the rock-solid certainty of a galactic bureaucracy, which was basically a revolution. After 5 days under observation, they finally let him make a supervised call home. The faster-than-light connection had this frustrating multi-second lag, making the conversation feel totally disjointed, like they were yelling at each other across the Grand Canyon. But seeing his parents' faces on the screen, all pixelated and worried, was the best thing he'd seen in weeks. "Alden, are you okay?" his mother asked, her voice reaching him a few seconds after her lips had moved. "I'm fine, Mom," he managed, forcing a smile. "The rooms here are actually great. Food's a little boring, kind of like staying in a super fancy minimalist hospital." "Your father told me what you said in your last message," she replied. "He thinks it's funny." Just then, his dad's face popped into the frame, grinning from ear to ear. "Funny? It's hilarious. So let me get this straight. These big, scary aliens think we're some kind of extinct space orcs who munch on toasters for breakfast?" "Something like that," Alden confirmed, the audio lag making the whole thing feel surreal. "And you decided to tell them we're still around?" His dad's voice crackled. The video showed him slapping his knee, laughing. "That's my boy, stirring up trouble on a galactic scale. Robert, this is serious." He heard his mom scold his dad a moment later. "He's in custody." "It's more like concerned observation, Mom," Alden tried to explain, wanting to calm them down. "They're mostly just really, really confused." He did his best to tell them the whole story, the lecture, the monster truck, the dead alien monitor. The entire tale sounded even more ridiculous saying it out loud across a chasm of light years. His mother's smile vanished. "The government called. The real diplomats. They're on their way." "They said this is a delicate situation," Alden murmured. "I know. I'll be careful." "You better be," she said, her voice catching. "Just stay safe, honey." "I will, Mom. I love you guys." "We love you too, son." His dad's voice came through, all the humor gone. "Knock 'em dead, figuratively." The call ended, plunging the white room back into silence. He stared at the blank wall where their faces had been, and the distance to home suddenly felt both shorter and impossibly vast. He was just a student. And now, the future of the human race might be on his shoulders, all because he couldn't keep his mouth shut during a boring lecture. 3 shifts later, after non-stop digging, Administrator Phyllis stared at the glowing anomaly on his screen, the fur on his neck standing straight up. He'd been diving through the digital guts of the Sol system monitoring station, hopped up on a calf stem so strong it was classified as a Class II industrial solvent, and he found it. The station, a tiny automated outpost in the Oort cloud, had been sending its weekly no significant change report to the Threat Containment Division like clockwork for 93 years. Beautiful. Reliable. The only problem was, its life support systems had registered a catastrophic failure 53 years ago. For over half a century, that same outpost had also been sending a weekly emergency alert life support offline message. But Regulation 8B/9, a true masterpiece of bureaucratic idiocy, required an on-site organic confirmation of any life support failure before the alert could be escalated. Without that confirmation, the system just automatically filed the emergency alerts as low-priority maintenance requests. And who was supposed to receive those alerts? The station's one and only occupant, the monitor, the dead monitor. "You have got to be kidding me," Phyllis whispered, all of his eyes wide. The system had been spamming a corpse's inbox with panic emails for half a century. At the same time, a completely separate automated program, running independently, kept pinging the central server with the all's clear report that everyone actually looked at. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of catastrophic failure. He needed to see it for himself. He requisitioned a high-speed probe from the nearest patrol sector, flagging it with so many priority codes that it probably gave the sector's logistics officer a full-body twitch. Hours later, the video feed came in. The sleek, silent probe drifted toward the ancient monitoring station's viewport. Its external lights flickered on, piercing the darkness inside. And there he was, floating in the zero-gravity command center, the monitor, a long-dead vril, perfectly preserved by the cold vacuum of space. He was a mummified husk, skin stretched tight over his skeleton, facing his console with one dry, bony finger hovering less than a millimeter from the send report button. He'd probably been about to file his weekly update when the air ran out. Phyllis stared at the grotesque image of the dead monitor, eternally at his post. He took a long, slow sip of his calf stem. Then he opened a new form. Status update, Terran file. In the main body, he wrote a single sentence, visual confirmation of monitoring oversight attached. He attached the probe's image file, sent it directly to Chief Administrator Vorn and the heads of every single department involved, and hit send. Across the galactic capital, 1,000 data slates chimed at once. The galactic bureaucracy, a beast that had moved at a glacial pace for millennia, ground to a horrified, screeching halt. A standard week after Phyllis's report threw the compact into a panic, Ambassador Huxley arrived. She was exactly what Alden expected a human diplomat to be, sharp, professional, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, and looking completely and utterly out of her depth. She and her team of aides showed up and within an hour had turned his comfortable prison into a makeshift embassy, their movements efficient and coordinated. "Alden," she said, her voice calm and measured as she scanned a data slate, "we've reviewed your testimony to the university panel. It had spirit." "They think we eat metal," Alden said, pacing the room. "I felt spirited was an understatement." "Diplomacy is a delicate process," Huxley countered, her eyes still glued to the slate. "It requires patience, nuance. We must appear peaceful and cooperative. Our official strategy will be to apologize for the misunderstanding, stress our commitment to peaceful coexistence, and petition for a probationary membership in the compact." Alden stopped dead in his tracks. "Apologize? Apologize for what?" "For surviving. And for the clerical error that led to your unvetted enrollment," she said smoothly. "We take the blame for the paperwork. It's a gesture of goodwill. It shows we're reasonable." "They'll see it as weakness, not reason," Alden argued, his fists clenching. "They have a myth about us being monsters, and now the monster is politely asking to be let in the front door. It just confirms everything they already believe. They'll think it's a trick." "That is a risk we'll have to take," Huxley said, finally looking up at him, her expression firm. "This is procedure, Alden. We go slow. We build trust. We avoid making waves." Before Alden could argue back, a soft chime filled the room. A hard light projection bloomed in the center of the chamber, forming a glowing, ornate scroll. "An official summons," Huxley said as she read it. For the first time, her professional composure cracked, a web of fine lines appearing around her eyes. "What is it?" Alden asked. "The news about the dead monitor." "It's leaked," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The whole galaxy knows the compact lost track of us for a century because of their own negligence. They're panicking." Huxley shook her head. "No, they're deflecting. To save face, they're calling a special tribunal in the Grand Chamber. They're reframing their own bureaucratic screw-up as an evaluation of an emergent Terran threat." She looked at Alden, her eyes wide with shock. "They're putting all of humanity on trial, and they've summoned you as the primary witness." "This actually works in our favor," Talia chirped, her crest feathers quivering with excitement. They were huddled in a secure study area in the university library, surrounded by walls of glowing ancient texts. The news of the tribunal had sent the campus into a frenzy, but for Talia, it was the ultimate academic challenge. "How is any of this good?" Alden asked, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm about to get cross-examined by a council of aliens who think I'm one step above a rabid dog." "Because you've changed the whole game," she explained, her talons tapping and swiping across a data sleeve. "This isn't an academic debate anymore. It's a political one. If the compact wants to judge humanity on its history, then it's only fair to apply the same standard to the judges. You want to dig up dirt on the council. I want to find historical truth," Talia corrected him primly. "The compact is so proud of its enlightened, peaceful present, but a millennia is a very long time. No civilization gets to be a galactic power through polite conversation. They've just had more time to bury the bodies and burn the records." Her access to the university archives was like a skeleton key to galactic history. The compact had sealed the most sensitive files, of course, locking them away behind security mandates. But Talia wasn't looking at the files, she was looking at the gaps. "Here," she said, pointing a delicate claw at a line of text, "a respected Eckalan history of their early spacefaring era. It mentions the Gahnarl consolidation, a period of rapid territorial expansion. The footnotes for that entire chapter cite a dozen source texts, and every single one of them ends with the same notification. The file was locked down tight, Compact Security Mandate 8.4. They're definitely hiding something, Alden murmured. Of course they are, Talia chirped back, her claws clicking softly on the console. But when you black something out, it still leaves a shadow. She cross-referenced the consolidation's dates with old planetary ecological surveys. Look at this, she said. 6 rival Ott and Hive worlds all show signs of sudden catastrophic ecological collapse, all within the same 50-year window. It's exactly what you'd see if someone used a world seed, a terraforming bomb that just erases the local life and plants a new forest. Alden stared, his eyes wide. They turned their rivals into trees. It's a strong theory anyway, Talia said, a series of satisfied clicks coming from her throat. They kept digging, diving deeper into the history of Talia's own people, the Valerie, and found a period they called the Sky Purge. The official history books called it a campaign to wipe out a terrible agricultural plague. But when they checked it against sealed medical records, they found the blight was actually a custom-made metal salt. It was harmless to aliens, but for any species that lived on the ground, it meant they could never have children again. A disturbing picture started to form. Secrets, perfectly timed plagues, and rivals who just went quiet. For every single species on the council, they found a skeleton in the closet, a version of history with holes big enough to fly a cargo ship through. Alden kept taking notes, not even sure how he could use this. He gripped the stylus, his knuckles bone white, as he stared at the list of horrors they had whitewashed from history. Ambassador Huxley wanted to be diplomatic. She wanted to build bridges. But Alden had a growing suspicion that the only thing these aliens would respect was being shown a mirror. He was a freak show. The news networks were going absolutely wild over the living fossil. Drones hovered outside his window day and night, their camera lenses trained on him. He'd become the galaxy's biggest reality star, a walking, talking myth. Talia, the ARDA analyst, showed him the feeds. The coverage was a total circus. Sensational news reports showed cheesy actors in ridiculous monster suits, growling and chewing on fake spaceship parts. Conspiracy nuts were claiming he was a lab-grown super soldier leading a secret invasion fleet from Earth. Professor Vrigg was on every scholarly channel, practically buzzing with rage about hoaxes and the death of academic integrity. But something else was bubbling up too. A small but growing human rights movement made up mostly of college kids, rebels, and species who already had a bone to pick with the Council's old guard. They held small protests, projecting his face onto buildings with slogans like, "History is a conversation, not a lecture," and "My ancestors ate dirt too." Public opinion is splitting right down the middle, Talia observed, her head cocked to one side. You're either the villain or the victim. There's not a lot of room in between. Ambassador Huxley told him to just tune it all out. It's just background noise, she said, though her voice was strained. The only opinions that count are inside the grand chamber. His face was all over the news, but it wasn't just Alden Renner, exchange student, anymore. It was the face of humanity. They would judge every single word he said, every tiny move he made, as the official statement for his entire species. The burden of 8 billion lives, past, present, and future, was settling on his shoulders, and he felt like it was crushing him. Meanwhile, Administrator Filk typed the last sentence of his report. For the first time in weeks, his office was silent. Even the cappist brewer in the corner had finished its job. The report was a masterpiece of brief, factual, and absolutely soul-crushing prose. It laid out, in painful detail, the decades of screw-ups, the monitoring station's broken automation, the automated error reports that had been pinging a dead man's email for years, the catastrophic failure to communicate between cultural outreach and threat containment. There were the budget cuts that left the databases to rot, and the chain reaction of small mistakes that had cascaded into one massive oversight. He used completely neutral language, letting the facts themselves scream the accusations from the page. His official recommendation was short and, he knew, completely pointless. Item 1. A full posthumous reprimand of Monitor Volto for failing to maintain operational status. Item 2. A system-wide reprimand of all departments involved for gross procedural negligence. Item 3. A formal, unconditional apology to the Terran species for the century-long monitoring screw-up and the resulting botched first contact. He fully expected this council to just toss it in the trash. The trial was already scheduled. They had already picked their scapegoat. A big public show was always better than quiet, boring reform. Admitting you were wrong was against the compact's very nature. He triple-checked the recipient list, attached his digital signature, and sent the report. On his datapad, the little red icon for the Terran file, the one that had haunted his every waking moment, flashed a calm, peaceful green before disappearing into the archives forever. For the first time in weeks, his desk was clear. Administrator Filk leaned back in his chair, feeling every muscle go slack as the sheer exhaustion of the affair washed over him. He closed his eyes, just for a second. He was asleep instantly, dreaming of empty inboxes and perfectly organized files. A week later, the day of the tribunal came. The Galactic Compact's Grand Chamber wasn't built to inspire awe. It was built to crush spirits. It was a giant, cavernous bowl carved from non-reflective black stone, so huge you couldn't even see the other side through the gloom. Hundreds of pods, each representing a member species, floated in silent, tiered rings around the chamber. It felt less like a courtroom and more like a tomb. Alden walked beside Ambassador Huxley, his footsteps echoing in the massive space. He could feel the weight of thousands of eyes pressing down on him. It was a collective stare of curiosity, fear, and disgust. He was a bug under a microscope. On a high, single platform in the center of the room sat the tribunal, led by the Catherian concordance speaker, Asildra. She was less a single creature and more a walking, talking colony, a living, shifting pillar of what looked like fossilized coral. Her body was so matte it seemed to absorb light, making her edges look blurry. When she moved, it was with a slow, grinding motion that spoke of immense awe, like a mountain deciding to shift. Speaker Asildra raised a gavel of polished black stone and brought it down on a matching stone block. The sound was a deep, final thud that vibrated right through the floor and up Alden's spine. Humanity's trial had officially begun. Ambassador Huxley's opening statement was a masterclass in diplomacy. It was eloquent, it was reasonable, and it was completely useless. She talked about second chances, about the need for communication, and about the potential for a great partnership between humanity and the Compact. The chamber was dead silent. Alden scanned the faces in the floating pods. Not a single expression changed. They were listening to her the same way a scientist might listen to the chirps of a newly discovered insect. When she was done, Speaker Sildra leaned forward. The movement made a low, grinding sound, like continents rubbing together. Her voice, when it came, was the same, a slow, heavy rumble, as if she were pulling each word up from the planet's very core. "We acknowledge your appeal to emotion, Ambassador," Asildra grated. The universal translator did its best to capture her tone, finally settling on glacial condescension. "However, the facts are what they are. The Compact flagged the Terran species as extremely aggressive. Your own historical records, patchy as they are, show centuries of constant internal warfare." "We've moved beyond that," Huxley said, her voice strained. "We learned from our past." "Did you?" Asildra rumbled. "Our records show you spread to every solid body in your solar system in less than 3 of your centuries. That's a speed of expansion that screams unchecked ambition. It's a pattern that matches the early stages of every fallen empire this Compact has ever had to deal with." Huxley tried to reason with them, to explain the context of the Cold War, the space race, the simple desire to explore. But her words just slid right off the tribunal's wall of certainty. They weren't there for a conversation. They were there to confirm what they already believed. They took her politeness for dishonesty, her attempts at nuance as a confession of guilt. Alden sat behind her, his stomach twisting into a tighter knot with every word. Someone slipped a data pad into his hand. It was Huxley's notes, talking points for him, stress peace, show regret for the misunderstanding, bow to the compact's wisdom. He glanced down at the polite, useless sentences. Then he looked up at Speaker Sildra's unmoving, ancient face and knew, with a sinking feeling, that they were going to lose. Huxley's way wasn't working. They were trying to argue with a brick wall, and that wall was about to come crashing down on them. "This tribunal has heard the empty pleasantries of your designated diplomat," Speaker Sildra boomed, dismissing Huxley with a slight grinding shift of her body. "Now, we will hear from the anomaly itself." Her blank face swiveled toward him. "The specimen, Alden Renner, will approach the floor." The specimen. That one word hit him like a physical blow, a shock of cold clarity. All the fear, the frustration, the crushing pressure of the last few weeks suddenly fused together into a single sharp point of anger deep in his chest. He got to his feet, and on legs that felt like they were shaking, walked toward the center of the chamber. The only sound in the colossal chamber was his own footsteps. He could feel Ambassador Huxley's stare, along with the crushing weight of 1,000 alien glares, 1,000 years of pure prejudice. He finally stopped on a circular platform right beneath the council's dais and looked up at the monolithic giant known as Speaker Eldra. He felt like a single man standing before a mountain. The stone-like being leaned forward, the sound of grinding rock filling the silence. "Tell us, human," she rumbled, her question already a verdict. "Why should we believe your species is any different from the monsters your own history paints you to be?" This was it. The moment of truth. Odin glanced down at the data slate Huxley had handed him. It was filled with carefully crafted talking points, polite diplomatic phrases, and desperate pleas for understanding. He imagined himself speaking those words, his voice swallowed by the vast dead chamber, and he knew, with absolute certainty, they would fail. It would be like trying to reason with a tidal wave. He looked up at Speaker Iodra's ancient, unreadable face. Her decision was already etched in stone. The other council members were just as impassive, their expressions dripping with judgment. This wasn't a trial. It was a sentencing. Suddenly, his breathing evened out. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. If he was going down swinging. He calmly placed the data slate on the floor. A shocked electronic gasp echoed from the human delegation's viewing pod. He shot a look over at Ambassador Huxley. Her face was a mask of pure panic. But then their eyes locked and she gave him the tiniest, almost invisible nod. That nod meant everything. It was surrender. It was permission. It said, "Go on, kid. Do what you have to do. We're sunk anyway." Odin took a deep breath and stared directly at the spot where Speaker Eldra's eyes would be, if she had them. He let the silence hang in the air, forcing them to wait, forcing them to pay attention. "You want to know why you should believe we're civilized?" he asked, his voice ringing out, clear and steady. "The real question is, why should we believe the same of you?" A ripple of disbelief washed through the chamber. No one expected that. "You asked me to answer for my history," Odin pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "You want me to apologize for a history book that you wrote? Well, let's talk about that book. You wrote the original manual on how to be monsters. You just burned the pages you didn't like." The chamber exploded in outrage, but Odin wasn't finished. He tore his gaze away from the speaker and scanned the floating pods, his eyes landing on the delegation from Okat. He saw Professor Vrigg, his woody skin practically vibrating with indignation. "You," Odin said, his voice slicing through the noise. "The Akatans. You lecture us about our violent expansion. Your official history calls it the Garo Consolidation, a golden age when you peacefully unified your corner of the galaxy. Funny thing, though, someone has sealed every single original document from that time. Why is that?" He pushed, not giving them a second to answer. What about the planetary surveys Talia and I dug up, the ones you forgot to seal? They show that 6 different worlds were ecologically replaced, suddenly and artificially, over just 50 years. Right around the time your rival hives went quiet, your consolidation wasn't unification. You blanketed their worlds with a bioweapon that rewrote their genetics, turning entire planets into silent forests. You called it progress. The lights in the Akaton pod suddenly dimmed. He then turned to the Valerie delegation, Tally's people. And you? Your histories talk about a noble sky purge to fight off a blight. But they conveniently leave out that the blight was an engineered metal salt that only made ground-dwelling species sterile. You committed genocide with fertilizer. What a coincidence, right? A silent, agitated rustle went through the Valerie as they ruffled their feathers. Finally, he brought his attention back to the dais, back to the silent stone judge. And you, Speaker Eldra, and the Kytherians, your people are praised for your wisdom, your patience. You've been around for millions of years, but you used to have company, didn't you? What happened to the sentient gas clouds of your sister planet? Your history books are very simple on that point. They just say the clouds fell silent. You didn't even bother to lie. You just waited for everyone to forget they ever existed. For the first time, the speaker's slow, constant shifting came to a dead stop. She was perfectly still. The mountain was actually listening. "This is not a competition," Odin's voice boomed, silencing the angry murmurs. "That misses the point entirely." He held up his hands in a gesture of peace, which felt pretty ironic given the firestorm he'd just created. "The point is, every single one of you has a history to answer for. You're just older. You've had more time to hide the bodies and write your own heroic version of the truth." He paused, letting his voice soften just a little. "Yes, humanity had horrible wars. We committed unspeakable acts against ourselves. We built weapons that could crack our own planet in half. We poisoned our air and water. We almost wiped ourselves out a dozen times over. We know exactly what we are because our history is a raw, open wound that we look at every single day. We teach it to our children. We build museums to our greatest failures. We carry that weight with us, a constant, painful reminder of what we're capable of, so we can fight every day to be better than we were." He looked back up at the silent speaker and the entire assembly. "You all have those same scars. You just pretend you can't see them. You cover them up and call it wisdom. You judge us for a past we're fighting to overcome, while you live in a present built on a past you won't even admit exists." The chamber was utterly silent. His accusation hung in the air like a physical weight. "So that's your choice. You can work with a flawed, scarred, but hopefully improving people to build a better future together. Or you can sit on your mountain of forgotten bones, judge us for the crime of having a history you can still see, and prove that you haven't grown at all. You can prove you're the very same monsters you claim you outgrew. The choice is yours." He was done. The words echoed and faded into the immense silence. Odin stood there, breathing hard, his hands clenched into tight fists. The adrenaline rush was gone, leaving him feeling shaky and hollowed out. He had done it. He had yelled at the mountain. But the silence that followed was different. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy with shock and condemnation. 1,000 years of comfortable, self-righteous beliefs had just been shattered. He had held up a mirror, and no one liked what they saw. Speaker Eldred just stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The living statue was completely still. Then, with a slow, grinding sound, she raised her gavel of polished black stone. She brought it down with a resonating boom. "This tribunal is in recess." Her voice was flat. The condescending tone was gone. It was just heavy. She turned, a motion that took several long seconds, and glided away from the dais. The mountain had retreated. Odin stumbled back toward the human pod, his legs feeling like jelly. Ambassador Huxley was just staring at him, her mouth hanging open, her entire diplomatic strategy completely up in smoke. She looked at him with a mixture of terror and stunned awe. Far away, Back at her university, Talia Shavine watched the whole thing on a live feed. Her crest feathers fanned out in a shimmering display of color. Odin hadn't just offered a defense, he had proposed a new, terrifying, and completely compelling theory about the galaxy, and in doing so, he had changed it forever. They were led to a comfortable waiting room, a gilded cage to hold them until the verdict came. Ambassador Huxley paced nervously, her eyes fixed on the wall. "You may have just saved our entire species," she said, her voice tight. "Or you just signed our collective death warrant." "Felt like it was worth a shot," Odin mumbled, collapsing into a plush chair, completely drained of energy. Before Huxley could respond, the door chimed and slid open. A young Akatan diplomat stepped inside. You could tell he was young. His woody fibers still had the bright sheen of youth. His eyes were locked on Odin. He walked straight to him and gave a stiff, formal bow. "Your words," the Akatan buzzed quietly, "had measurable merit. My people have been silent about the consolidation for many generations. Perhaps it is time we spoke of it." He set a data slate on the table in front of Odin, a preliminary proposal for a technological and cultural exchange, should your species be available for such things. He bowed again and left as quickly as he arrived. Huxley stared at the slate as if it were a venomous snake. The door chimed again. This time it was a Valari academic. Her crest feathers were held in a posture of deep respect. She wanted to debate the ethics of interacting with pre-industrial societies and the philosophy of inherited guilt. She was followed by an envoy from the Glib-Glibs, who scurried in, offered a frantic bow with all of his limbs, and formally apologized for an unfortunate monitoring oversight on his bureaucracy's part. As a personal apology, he offered a lifetime supply of high-grade coffee beans. One by one, a small stream of delegates trickled in, each one looking at them with a new, wary curiosity. Odin's speech hadn't won them allies, not yet, but it had earned them something far more valuable: respect. He had forced them to see humanity not as a monster, but as a mirror. The galactic dam of prejudice was still standing, but he had just put 1,000 cracks in it. When Speaker Aildra finally reconvened the tribunal, the whole feeling in the grand chamber was different. The cold silence was gone, replaced by a low hum of debate coming from the floating pods. The air of arrogant certainty had vanished, leaving behind a thick fog of uneasy self-reflection. Imagine standing trial for your entire species. That's where Alden was, a lone human in a vast chamber filled with stone-faced aliens who had already decided his people were galactic-level threats. The lead judge, Sildra, was as unmoving as a mountain, but Alden could swear he saw a crack in her stony confidence. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low rumble, but the words were a shock. "This tribunal has reevaluated the evidence presented," she grated out. The council members, the Catharians, didn't even try to hide their disapproval. In light of new arguments suggesting systemic historical oversights, this body hereby reclassifies the Terran question. The room went silent. The issue is no longer a security threat, but an administrative review. She lifted her gavel. "We are dropping all preemptive aggression charges against the Terran species. Their vessel and delegates are free to go." Ambassador Huxley let out a breath she'd been holding for a week, but Sildra wasn't finished. By unanimous decree, this council grants the species known as humanity provisional membership in the Galactic Compact, pending a period of cultural integration and mutual observation. It was a partial victory, a foot in the door. They were on probation, but they were in. A wave of pure exhaustion washed over Alden. Weeks later, he walked back into the amphitheater for his History 301 class. Things were slowly getting back to normal. He was still a minor celebrity on campus, but the stares had turned into respectful nods. He'd heard his old professor, the one who taught that humans were savages, had taken a long-term sabbatical to reevaluate his core thesis. A new professor stood at the front of the room, a young, energetic Valari with bright, curious eyes. Behind her, the topic of the day lit up the screen. Humanity, a case study in historical reevaluation and the dangers of singular data sources. Alden couldn't help but smile. Talia waved from the second row, saving him a seat. He slid in next to her as the lecture started. "Think they'll get it right this time?" she whispered, her colorful crest feathers fluttering with amusement. "Hard to say," Alden whispered back, relaxing into his chair. "But it's a start." He looked around at all the different faces from every corner of the galaxy, all here to learn the real story. He wasn't a specimen anymore, a living exhibit to be poked and prodded. He was just a student, surrounded by his peers, a part of a history that was still being written. The future was going to be complicated and probably full of paperwork, but for the first time since leaving Earth, it felt like it belonged to him, to all of humanity, and he was ready for whatever came next.